Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And today we have Michael Morgan. He is a licensed massage therapist and also is a diplomate for Cranial Sacral Therapy. He's the first guest that we've had on with this modality. Really excited about it because there are a lot of good, interesting, and great feedback from other people that have gotten treatment from this modality, and now we have an expert to let us know more about it. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here.
Absolutely, yeah. Usually when we look at massage therapists and other people, we've had many modalities on the show, but we haven't had anyone talk about cranial sacral therapy. But before we jump into that subject matter, how did you get into this line of work?
Well, as with many people that do cranial sacral, sometimes it's just a fluke. And I had an industrial automation company in the 80s, and I invented a way to cut glass with a laser. Talk about energy. And I had a lady friend that was doing it because she was with a meditation community, with transcendental meditation. And she just said, I think you might have a knack for this. So I very innocently started, and I was very surprised to find out how profound and how powerful it was, and I just got led into it. And that was in the early 90s.
Wow. So over 20 years of employing cranial sacral therapy, huh?
Yes.
That is huge because one thing that's really interesting, I think we're on like episode 55, and a lot of people that we've had on, they've had like this new resurgence or a new identity or just new life after around 2012. There was this major shift in a lot of people's lives. And you were doing it since the 90s, so we have a pioneer on the episode, David. So with cranial sacral therapy, did you jump right into that, or were you doing meditation beforehand or other modalities, and then you found that cranial sacral therapy was the way to go?
Yeah, I've been teaching meditation, transcendental meditation, for 40 years. I'm a little older. Mm-hmm. And then I jumped into cranial sacral therapy as well as a healing modality, and just started doing that. And I think what's reflective of this modality is just one thing leads to another. It almost seems like a series of coincidences, but it's as if nature draws you from one thing to the next, to kind of like you're supposed to do, if you will.
Now, if you could give us in the audience an overview of what is cranial. Actually, if you can give us your definition of the transcendental meditation as it relates to cranial sacral therapy, that would be even better.
Yeah, and that's tricky, but I can do it. So it's actually not. So that's good. I never, since I stepped into it and started. Transcendental meditation, that was taught by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi years ago. You remember the Beatles, and more recently David Lynch and Oprah Winfrey, that kind of thing. Ellen DeGeneres. It's a very ancient technique. It's really a mantra meditation where one has a sound that doesn't have a meaning, and it allows you to experience deeper and deeper and deeper levels of the thought process. And it's like a honeybee to the mind. Once the mind gets the opportunity to settle, it's straight to an area of greater intelligence and bliss. And the transcending part doesn't mean to be in a trance per se, but it means to go beyond to the source of thought, or what unified field theory physics calls the unified field or vacuum state from which all matter, according to the most advanced physicists, emerges. So it's a way mentally to allow the mind to settle down. And when the mind settles down, the body automatically settles down as well. And with that, the body can release deeper-rooted stress. And when that does so, the human nervous system has the ability to resonate at a much deeper and more coherent and orderly level. So it's using the instrumentality of sound on a very subtle level to just draw the mind to a more ordered, coherent state, if you will. And how cranial sacral therapy relates to that, at least my experience, is through the modality of touch. It kind of allows us to do the same thing. Through touch, we can transcend, if you will, and as our touch becomes more refined and delicate, it allows us to feel the pulsations of the body in a very subtle and powerful way. So I know that sounds a little abstract, but that's kind of the principle of how we're using touch to go to a greater and more organized feel of intelligence, which is why I think we get some of the results that we do with cranial sacral therapy.
Gotcha. Now, when people come to see you, is there a certain issue that they're dealing with? Have you found that there's a certain issue that cranial sacral therapy is fantastic for? I know we're going to talk about specifics in your research, but in the early days, I'm just wondering how people were coming to you. Were they, I've done transcendental meditation and the next step is cranial sacral therapy?
Well, not necessarily, although I live in a little community called Fairfield, Iowa, where people do that. But a general person from the real world, the most common type of laundry list of symptoms that we seem to have effectiveness with are things like headaches and migraines. That's a crowd pleaser. We've had a lot of success with that. People that might have digestive disorders, autoimmune things, especially lower back pain, anything that has to do with the spine, any kind of a positional issue or something structurally in the body. And more recently, we have ventured into the area of concussions. I worked with a gentleman named Ricky Williams, who's an NFL player. We did a whole study on NFL players and found that, for example, cranial sacral therapy seems to help heal the brain and the trauma from the brain getting a bit jangled, when your head gets hit all the time. So those are some of the things that have come our way over the years.
Ricky Williams is quite the adventurous person. We had a guest on not too long ago that is with Access Consciousness, and I believe he's a part of Access as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's great. And so, how does it differ from massage therapy? Kind of walk us through. I know I'm a glutton for going to the massage place for 2 hours at least. So, what is it like? Is it the same and what's the similarities and what's the differences?
Well, and different. Like I got a massage today since I'm on the road so much, and of course, with massage you're working on the level of the muscles and the lymph and the fluid, and of course, just getting that allows your body to settle down and release toxins, right? So, almost everyone feels more relaxed, depending on the tension that one carries with them, right? So, you could say that on the neuroskeletal muscular level, massage works in that way. And by contrast, cranial sacral therapy, which a lot of massage therapists does, works on the level of not only the muscles and bones and even the skeletal level, but it allows someone to tap into the level of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid, which is the fluid which bathes the brain and spinal cord. So it's kind of like a level of body awareness and functioning, which is even below the neuroskeletal muscular level. And I kind of explain it to my students like, if somebody had a bed sheet and they could get the bed sheet that was the furthest one over and pull that, all the other sheets would come along. So without even looking like we're doing much at all. It looks like a whole bunch of nothing because it's so subtle. The central nervous system can get as if rebooted. It can actually shift and change its way of functioning. So the mind-body system becomes much more coherent and much more resonant. And so it's very complementary to massage, and I think on some levels a bit more effective as well. So a lot of people start massage, they get cranial, and they go like, well, I might not want to give up my massage, but I like this cranial. It's like, I don't know what you're doing, but almost to a man or woman, people report that they feel more relaxed and very deeply settled. And very often they feel like their consciousness is much more expanded as well. And similar to the principle of meditation, when they get in that deep state of relaxation, those toxins at a deeper level can be released. So that's a little bit of the short form explanation, if you will.
Michael, before you got into cranial sacral therapy and before you been associated with the Upledger Institute, what's your background? What were you doing before all this?
Well, being a long-term meditator, I went to school at Berkeley years ago, and I studied philosophy and physics. And then I got into meditation and taught that a lot in different places, went to courses around the world. And then in the 1980s, when computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing was coming up, I had a friend of mine that came up to me one day, and he goes, Mike, do you know anything about how to cut glass with a laser? And I go, no. And so then I ran up a $100 bill at in his dorm room researching, and we found a way in Iowa to use an industrial laser to cut glass, which then morphed into this thing called an industrial water jet. And we found a way to cut glass in curlicues in ways that never had. It was a revolutionary technique that no one had ever cut glass that way forever. So it was the first really big breakthrough in glass cutting for 400 years. So I think on the basis of meditation, because meditators are pretty creative, we found a way to invent a whole new technology that's based on what's called computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing. So I got to really understand how there was the biomechanics of machines. Like how you look at a robotic arm and it mimics the body. So inadvertently, I got to understand how machines actually mimic the body and how one could do something different, melding together something like a water jet and a computer. This is when Apple II computers first came out. Those were some of the first laptop computers that we learned how to program. So for this industrial water jet. So when I got into cranial sacral, it was like I was transferring my knowledge of robotics to the level of biomechanics in the body at a more subtle level. And I kind of joke that I went from high-pressure hydraulic systems to low-pressure hydraulic systems in the body. So I've just always been curious about how things work, the mechanics of things. So I think I kind of transferred something in that area in coordinating engineers to something in body mechanics as well. I know that sounds kind of disparate, but it's like going from one level to another, just kind of inventing things and finding out how things work.
Yeah.
So the thread in all this was that always being curious how things work, as my mentor, Dr. Upledger, John Upledger was, who was brilliant. He would just research and find ways that the body, how does the body move in a subtle way? And what could be the applications? And his experience is that people would just show up, like autistic kids, and he started that, and he found out, this works with autistic kids, and it works with headaches, and it works with digestive disorders. And my particular thing that came to me, quite by accident, is that my sister-in-law and my stepmother both died of Alzheimer's. And I started to think, well, maybe this cranial sacral that I've been doing could help with that as well. So that kind of just inadvertently led me into pioneering or looking at that application.
say, that was going to be my next question. I was going to say, how did you kind of come across that it could help people with Alzheimer's? So that's kind of answer that question.
Dr. Upledger, my mentor, he wrote an article in Massage Therapy magazine in early 2000. And basically, he commented, he said that people that are middle-aged, whatever that means these days, he mentioned that the flow of cerebral spinal fluid, which is the fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, is their turnover or production, if you will, cerebral spinal fluid is half that of a normal adult. And I started to think, well, that's interesting, because you even ask a regular doctor these days without a lot of training, they will see on MRIs and brain scans a lot of times that people that are older, maybe past 50, their brain looks like it starts to shrink a little bit, right? So then I had a nurse practitioner at University of Iowa, because we were thinking of doing a study on this, started to do research, and she found that people with senile dementia, their flow of cerebral spinal fluid was 75% less than a normal adult. So, talk about shrinkage, we thought, well, that's significant. Maybe that has something to do with the way that they display the symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia, and maybe that has something to do with this amyloid plaque that gets stuck in the brain, it gets formed. So then we started to think, there's really a simple technique in cranial sacral therapy. It's called the still point. It takes about a day to learn, and you can do it in 5 minutes to 10 minutes a day. But we thought maybe that could pump up the volume. And when I gave a TED Talk on this a couple of years ago, I had 7 minutes to explain cranial sacral therapy, cerebral spinal fluid, inflammation, and Alzheimer's dementia. So how do you explain that in 7 minutes, right? So I used a simple analogy. It's like a river. And when a river is freely flowing, things are great. But if the river starts to dry up, like a water table, then things flow more slowly, right? And when a river dries up really, really dry, all the mud and sludge and silt clogs everything together. That's what happens in the brain. Is that this is the whole essence of my talk around the country at conventions. It's like the brain dries up, and when the brain dries up, and you can see an Alzheimer's brain, it looks like a shrunken walnut, and when the brain dries up, all that mud and sludge and silt, like in the river, that's analogous to all that amyloid plaque and the neurofibrillary tangles, which are part of Alzheimer's. That's what gets formed, and that's what starts to destroy the brain. And that's what, in my theory, accounts for all the cognitive decline and the lack of balance and the lack of word finding and all the other laundry list of symptoms that people have when they develop Alzheimer's dementia. So our simple theory is that if we could pump up the volume and teach therapists or lay people to do it, which we've been doing, they should start to see a difference in recovery and even reversal of the process.
Oh, wow.
I know, it sounds ridiculously simple, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I'm a little passionate about this. There's no known cure for Alzheimer's. I even had a teaching assistant a few weeks ago that worked for Pfizer, a big drug company, and they said Pfizer's, I don't know if this is true, she says Pfizer's giving up on Alzheimer's research because it's the one drug model doesn't work. It's just not one size fits all, because cranial sacral therapy allows you to honor the body and listen to the complexity of the body. And there might be several different ways that Alzheimer's comes along. Sometimes it's become because there's inflammation in the diet, it's improper diet. Sometimes it can be coming on from a blow to the head. Sometimes it's a hormonal imbalance. There's several different factors that may contribute to memory issues. But cranial sacral therapy across the board can help deal with the inflammation in the brain we find occurs and help increase the fluid flow of cerebrospinal fluid and help heal the brain.
What about on nutrition levels to help with that flow? Is there any relation between that?
here's what I found. And I stumbled onto this too. All this is not rocket science, but I had to figure it out. So one of my associates in Seattle says, Mike, there's a book by a guy named Mark Hyman. A lot of people know Mark Hyman. He's head of the Institute for Functional Medicine. And he wrote a book about the blood sugar solution years ago. And basically the theory is that depending on the type of food you eat, well, let me back up. Here's what I found out. I created a 2-day course for lay people. And I met with a fellow in Southern California who was on the head of the Southern California Alzheimer's board. He was on the board of directors of the Southern California Alzheimer's Association. And he said to me, he says, you know, Mike, about 40% of people in an Alzheimer's unit have diabetes. And I go, really? I didn't know that. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah. So I go, wow. And then I informally started to do a survey of all the people who worked in nursing homes, and they kind of in their head, I could see them counting the beds, and they go, yeah, that sounds about right. And it's like one of those obvious things that people, you know, don't look at, right?
Yeah.
And then I started to look at the medical records with permission of people that we treated, and found out that a lot of people that developed Alzheimer's for 20 years before had what I call certain diseases of aging, which were inflammatory in nature. That they could start with diabetes, and that could be brewing since they were 30 years old, cardiac problems, osteoporosis, arthritis, autoimmune diseases, and the tie-in with diet. It's not the whole story, but maybe it's half the picture a lot of time, is that what happens from the 20s and 30s, the standard American diet, or SAD, standard American diet, is that when you have a diet that's high in sugars and high in carbohydrates, that can, in many times, depending on your genetics, cause inflammation in the body, right? And
Yeah.
then you get high blood pressure, and you get higher cholesterol. I mean, all you have to do is look at CNN and the drug commercials, advertising Lipitor and A1C inhibitors is because it's a huge market. That's why they advertise this stuff on TV.
Yeah.
Another story as to whether or not they should really advertise and push drugs, but it's a huge market, and it affects tens of millions of people. In fact, what I found is that there's 79 million people in the United States that are pre-diabetic, and another 25 to 30 million that are diabetic. So that's 100 million people. That's a third of the population that are at risk. It's like a growing health crisis. Now, what happens is that in certain cases, thankfully not all, but in certain cases, over years, even though the body tries to fight it, the inflammation in the body overflows into the brain, which mirrors the insulin levels, insulin resistance. And so then you develop inflammation in the brain as well as inflammation in the body. So that's how diet fuels that. It's an insult to the body. Sugar in high concentrations can be toxic. So if that makes sense, that's how diet and certain types of diet can contribute to that. And it's not any accident that folks in their 70s and 80s that have been eating toxic diet and food that people told them was fine to eat for the last 30 years, all of a sudden start to develop this. Now, not in all cases, but in a certain number of cases, you can trace those things.
Yeah.
So that's why people are very keen on nutrition. It's like, hey, maybe what you eat over time has an effect on how your mind works.
Yeah.
Again, it's pretty common sense, but a lot of people don't want to look at it because, let's face it, food is comfort. So if we're really stressed and we don't want to meditate and we don't want to have a more holistic lifestyle, then food is soothing. There's a fellow, William Davis, who wrote a book called Wheat Belly. And he said that when you eat a piece of bread and butter it, a nice toasty piece of bread, that you get a rush. You get a lot of opiates. And he shows a picture on a PBS special. It shows how all the opiate receptors in the brain, millions of them, are triggered by these carbohydrates. So I kind of joke like, I'd love to have a relationship with you and have an intimate, connected relationship, but that's too much work. So just give me a couple of pieces of buttered bread. It's like buttered toast. Because you get a rush from that. And people in the food industry know that, and it's addictive. Food is addictive, but of course necessary. But certain types of carbohydrates and sugars are very soothing to the brain. So that's why it's hard to get people to kind of change their way. Anyway, I could go on, but you get the gist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're getting more and more information that these days is coming out. There's so much the gut can tell us what's going on with the person, and it's directly related to their health. And
the gut itself, there's more research. University of Virginia found a direct correlation between a nerve in the brain that goes directly to the gut. There's actually a physical hardwired correlate. People have thought so for years, so they actually found a physical correlate. And what happens is that about 70% of the immune system underlies the gut. It's kind of like piping. So when you eat something that's detrimental to you, directly or indirectly, it affects the immune system. And that has an effect on inflammation. So then you have a straight shot from what's called the glial cells, or these intelligent cells in the gut that start to influence the brain. So it's a very interactive piece. So what I started to do is I pieced this together, much to my surprise, is I go, what if we could stack the cards in our favor and reverse this process? That's what I call the body energy longevity prescription. What if we could do something like cranial sacral therapy, where we get a more immediate effect for the brain to start to improve its cognition? What if we could tie that with improvements in diet? What if we could, throw in a little exercise too? And then, if we were really wild and crazy, throw in some meditation. And then all of a sudden, we're stacking the cards in our favor. It's what we call epigenetics. It means beyond the genetics. And the idea in functional medicine that feels that medicine is food, for example. Mm-hmm. What if it were possible to turn off the genes, even if there's a genetic basis? What if it were possible to turn off the genes that are detrimental to us and turn on the ones that allowed us to function in a healthier way, and switch on those genes? So that's called epigenetics. So in other words, we have an influence, even though there's genetic markers, on influencing the outcome of our disease processes. And that's what my longevity prescription is about. It's like a simple prescription of really how to stack the cards in your favor.
So I have a question, since you're dealing with the University of Iowa and you're dealing with a lot of research folks and unintended consequences. So it makes me think of Fonzarelli and Happy Days and commercials in the 50s where they had their cigarettes rolled in their sleeve, and movies after a sex scene, they're smoking, right? Like it was the thing to do. And then, then in the 90s it was, oh, by the way, this tobacco is actually causing, that's why you have cancer,
Yeah, right,
and so,
right.
I'm going somewhere with this. So the second one, unintended consequence made me think of Viagra, right? Where initially that was, and just as an asterisk, I worked with a company that works with the pharmaceutical community. So anyway, with Viagra, that was supposed to be a blood pressure medicine, and then the unintended consequences, right, is the blue pill that we all know about.
Right.
And so the third part where I really want to get your take is I actually have some colleagues that are in the home care industry. And this one person that I'm thinking about was a pharmaceutical rep in the mid to late 90s, and they were really pushing at that time a lot of what was it? What is it when you have not high blood pressure, like the Lipitors and all that? What's that used for again? So anyway, when they were using those type of drugs, the unintended consequence was that, right, like in the commercial that nobody pays attention to, where they give you all the asterisks for the unintended consequences of taking this drug. They were saying that it was shrinking. It was taking a lot of water fluid out of the brain, and that also contributed to another generation having Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Since you're with the research community, I want to get your take on that.
Well, let's go back to Viagra for a moment. I don't get to talk about this very much. Well, you got to look at, if one wanted to ask the right question, you could say, why does somebody need Viagra in the first place? And what happens in an aging population of men, now women have their own challenges, but in an aging population of men, their insulin levels and insulin resistance, because of the food they have been eating over decades, begins to rise. And that affects the vasculature of the body and the male organs as well as the brain. And the whole point of Viagra, as you noted, being a blood pressure medication in a sense, is it helps offset the vascular damage which occurs in the body, specifically in reproductive organs, but it's actually affecting the heart as well. Like, you know, when they say Viagra, don't take it if you have, you know, cardiac issues, blah, blah, blah. So when you look at why people need it in the first place, you have to look at the inflammation of the body. Because when men start to eat in a healthier way, all of a sudden those functions start to come back if they have an issue. So you got to kind of ask the question, why was there the need in that stuff in the first place? So that's part of the issue. When you start to connect the dots, it all starts to make sense, right? It all starts to make sense. But it takes decades to accumulate that. And so you have a certain population of men. Typically, the Viagra need is 50, 60, 70s, right? Sometimes it might just be for fun and recreation, but in a lot of cases it's like, yeah, these guys are reflecting dysfunction that's been brewing for many, many, many years, many decades. And then they're on the tail end of it, like, oh yeah, something's going wrong. I can't even function in a certain way. So that's just a piece of that. And sorry, that's a little off topic, but I just wanted to mention that. It's just reflective of inflammation in the body that then is also showing up in the brain. Now, go back to your original question. I'll answer that.
Sure. No, it's all connected. So I appreciate you using that for Viagra, because you're saying it's all connected. And so what I was saying is when they were using this cholesterol pills, right, some of the side effects was that it was actually exacerbating the shrinking of the brain, and so you have a greater number of people getting dementia. I didn't know what your experience has been with that at all, or if there's any conversation about that. You see there's an aging population, and there's more and more evidence of Alzheimer's as an epidemic, and that is partially, I think, a reflection of the diet. And here's a little aside, by the way. Dr. Upledger, when he was studying in the 60s as an osteopathic student at Kirksville, Missouri, he had a mentor by the name of Stacy Howe. And Stacy Howe he was a runner-up for biochemistry. And when cholesterol medications started to become, kind of popular, his mentor was saying, he says, I don't think cholesterol is the culprit. Because what cholesterol is doing, and now other doctors like Mark Houston and other functional doctors are talking about, he's saying, I don't think cholesterol is the bad guy. I actually think that what the cholesterol is doing is trying to surround the arteries and veins and keep them from being damaged because there's inflammation in the vascular system. So the cholesterol is actually trying to help protect the body. But at the time, because of medical and pharmaceutical politics, there was a big campaign to say, let's do anti-cholesterol. So in other words, but not looking so deeply enough at the cause, and you're missing the point. So to that point, because you're taking something that is treating a symptom but not actually reflecting the cause, then you get things like drawing liquids out of the brain and exacerbating that. It's one of those, as you say, unintended consequences. So, look at in terms of treating dementia, there's another Dr. Dale Bredesen who's come up with a whole program over months to help reduce and prevent Alzheimer's. And I really think he's on the right track. I hope to meet him in the next month or so. But I'm saying our work with Cranial Sacral Therapy can accelerate the results even more quickly, maybe 10 times faster. So it may take him 10 months to get a result. We can do it in a
matter of 12 to 16 weeks as a general rule of thumb in terms of showing reversal. But reversal by any means is absolutely amazing. So the point is that what he says is that we're asking the drugs to do too much. One drug cannot do everything. There's like 30 different causative factors which might look at Alzheimer's. That's why a lot of drug companies are a little challenged, because it's not low-hanging fruit. It's not an easy thing to treat. So my analogy to pharmaceutical drugs like cholesterol, it's like, on your cell phone, everyone has a cell phone, right? And when you push the cell phone the wrong way, all the little apps start to jiggle. They jiggle, right?
Yeah.
And if you take your finger, they'll all switch around in ways you don't even want to do, right? That's what happens with drugs. You have a laser focus, and you have one molecule that are affected, but you don't know what's going to happen to all the other apps in the brain or the body. They're all going to switch around. That's equivalent to the side effects. Oh, I got to use that. I never use that.
That was a great analogy, right?
Yeah, but it's like those are the side effects, and one thing you can't know at the level of intelligence that the body's using, you can't accommodate or think of what can happen. So something with cranial sacral therapy and meditation, back to that idea of ground and intelligence, is that you're actually tapping into the intelligence of the body and mind in a way that the mind becomes a friend to what you're doing. It starts to take all these other considerations that no one human intellect could take into account. Now, I know that sounds a little metaphysical, but it's the idea on the level of quantum physics or unified field that we're resonating with a level of intelligence that's not just molecular, which is profound, but we're tapping into something that goes beyond molecular intelligence to the level of energy and field, which takes into account all these other interactive factors. So in a way, from a therapeutic point of view, we can walk and chew gum to get more profound results.
Michael, can CST, or I'll just refer to it as CST, is it something that you can be used, let's say, can address like a emotional type trauma?
Yeah, well, thanks for getting into that. So what Dr. Upledger found just by accident is that first he started with cranial sacral therapy and started to treat autistic kids, right? And then he developed a little bit more regional approach, which is what we teach in Cranial 2. It's another level. And then he started to develop, because people came to him, and he started to develop something called Somato emotion release. Somato meaning the body, and emotion means the emotion. So one of the stories is that he was treating a lady, I tell this in my classes, and a lady came in, and she lied down on the table, and Dr. Upledger was there with one of his graduate students. And she had a handbag with her, right? So she set it down right next to the table, which Dr. Upledger realized later probably was not a good idea. So he's treating the body and just doing the cranial, and all of a sudden she reaches up with her handbag and starts beating him over the head. And so what happened was her body went exactly into the position where she was getting a hysterectomy. And Dr. Upledger happened to be leaning on her leg the same way this resident was, and she was trying to get him off his leg. So needless to say, he was a little surprised. And he made an appointment for her to come back the next week, and wild horses could not have dragged that assistant from coming back to see what would happen. But out of that, he began to realize that you could tap into something called someone's inner wisdom or inner knowingness, which is probably one of his greatest contributions. And it's the idea that, on the outside we can get medical tests, we can get analysis, we can get an objective measure of how the body's working, which is fine and good. But he discovered through his hands, even though he's a very competent, very brilliant doctor, very versed well in anatomy and physics and biochemistry, he began to realize that through the hands and the body, we can start to dialogue with this inner wisdom inside of us. And if we're respectful and neutral in our dialogue, that we can actually listen to the inner wisdom of the body. Like, You ever had the experience where sometimes you know your body's trying to tell you something and you just kind of ignore it, right?
Yeah.
Like we all do that. But the body keeps giving us hints. And sometimes if we don't listen, it gives us more and more hints until we get sick and like, do I have your attention yet, right? So the idea is with Cranial Sacral Therapy, we train people at an advanced level to start to dialogue and say, let's talk to the part of the body that would like to change, and maybe there's some resistance, like there may be a very good reason the body's functioned how it has been to survive. But we could say, hey, maybe there's another way to do this. Maybe there's another way that the body could heal in a way that would be a win-win on a different level. And maybe we don't have to adapt the same strategy that we developed at 7 years old now that we're 70. And this is important in terms of our advanced treatment of Alzheimer's, even though I don't talk about this very much, because some people, they start to lose their memory because they just don't want to remember for, the trauma they've had in their life, and who can blame them? But if you can actually have a dialogue with the body and get something resolved, maybe you hated Uncle Joe for the last 20 years or Aunt Martha for the last 30, and find a resolution, maybe someone doesn't have to suppress that memory. Maybe they don't have to forget. So that's Somato emotional relief. That's something that advanced practitioners do as well. That can sometimes just bring a lot of relief and completion to someone that has carried something around for many, many years. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I just if it worked or if it could address emotional.
Oh yeah.
That's tremendous.
Because when I got into memory care, I realized, wait a minute, there's the physiological nuts and bolts like diet and inflammation, all well and good. That's a big part of the picture. But, we all know that sometimes it's like there's something on an emotional level that's why we don't want to remember. We see that all the time. And wouldn't it be great if we could give people that are older some level of resolution to honor who they are as elders, to honor who they have as wisdom, and that they could actually be listened to. And if there's any point I would make about cranial sacral therapy, is that it's a very profound way to honor and listen to the body and the mind. And I don't know how often people have said, you don't listen to me, right? And we're all so busy, right? But through the hands, if you can be respectful and listen, the body will start to give it up. The body will go, oh, you mean you're actually listening to me? Well, then I'll tell you. But if you're not going to listen to me, I'm not going to tell you what's going on. But if you listen respectfully, even silently, the body will start to shift. And as any of the old-timey osteopaths will tell you, the body is a self-correcting mechanism. If you listen respectfully enough, the body will almost start to change on its own. That's the inner wisdom at work.
Mm.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Hamza.
Sure. I have a unified field / inner wisdom, inner knowingness that I'd love to share with you, Michael. And due to time, I won't tell my story. I think it was great. In 2009, I had a cranial sacral therapy done. But the story I do want to tell is because I went to a I Could Do It conference, and it was in Toronto.
Right.
And they had a conference next door, Pilates conference. And so there was a lady there. She had her table, and she was doing cranial sacral therapy. And I had my experience. It was phenomenal. And I'm one of the people that if I love something, I tell the whole world. So I'm sitting I'm sitting next to this lady. I didn't know her. We were at a Brian Weiss session. And I was like, you got to go to this cranial sacral therapy. This is phenomenal. And she's like, okay. And so she goes, and, I leave her alone with the lady. She just starts crying uncontrollably. And, later I was like, what happened? And so she says, the lady didn't know me, but she knew I was pregnant. And she knew that the baby said that the baby knew that I didn't want her. Like she was newly married. They weren't really ready. And so the baby was like, you know what? If you don't want me here, then I won't come. And so all this happened during that session. Ultimately, she wound up having a baby. But I have to say, going through that session helped contribute to her decision.
Yeah. And the way that cranial sacral therapists are trained is not to project anything and say, hey, I feel this. It's like we simply ask, and the story comes out. So I think if the therapy was properly done, which it sounded like it was, this lady just listened, and the story came out. And it was like, wow. And she'd probably been sitting on it. So it just allowed her to have the space to clear that and to get some resolution, which is tremendous, right? Tremendous. Yeah.
How long is a session, Michael? When someone comes to you for a session, how long is it?
Typically an hour or so, typically.
An hour?
Having said that, I do a lot of what is called multi-hands therapy, where I may have more than one therapist work on someone at the same time. So, and that seems to speed up the process. So I'm training people this weekend in Chicago to do more of that. And in fact, pretty much paralleling what we did with the NFL study with Ricky Williams, we're having a one-week program in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida this year in August to treat people with Alzheimer's dementia with many therapists working on them at the same time. And that's going to be 5 full days. And the idea is we want to see if we can demonstrate how we can more rapidly get results in diminishing the results of Alzheimer's dementia.
And how long does it take for someone to get certified to become a craniosacral therapist?
Typically, and there's not a certification per se, but typically after they take the first 3 levels, which they might do every 6 months, take another level, then they can get qualified in what's called techniques and then diplomate. That's the CST thing I was explaining when we started. Level of qualification, so they can show they've had a certain level of professional competence to do that. But someone as a massage therapist can start right away. Like I taught a class last week in Bozeman, Montana, and I trained 20 people in 4 days, how they could start to go out and do the work.
So now, is all craniosacral therapy the same? And what I mean by when I say that, like, for example, someone could go see a spiritual healer and get a healing, but there's a lot of spiritual healers out there, and they don't all do the same type of healings. So that's my question is it all the same? Or are there people doing craniosacral therapy, but their process and everything about it is a little bit it's a lot different, or a little different?
Well, I think it's both and. So, for example, we talk about Upledger cranial sacral therapy. Upledger is based on John Upledger's protocol, and there's certain ways that we train, no matter who the teacher is. So we have 57 affiliates around the world. Pretty much the training is the same. We might tell different stories, but pretty much the principles and the techniques are the same. Okay? Now, having said that, you're going to have different personalities express that. My personality is one way, and somebody else could be very quiet, still get the same results. So, your personality is going to filter through that, but you're going to be doing the same techniques. Yeah. And then somebody can do kind of the basic generic form of cranial sacral therapy and get great results. But we have areas of specialization. So I developed for Upledger what's called the longevity curriculum, working with seniors and specializing with that. Some of my other associates are more focused on obstetrics and pediatrics. Other people in terms of inflammatory disease processes, other people with brain functioning per se, other people with concussions. So you can start from a general training and get great results. But then, if you wish, you can go into any number of specialties as well.
Okay.
Interesting. And I'm encouraged by, just your relationships. Seems like really extensive relationships with the research community, with the medical community. And just listening to you over the hour, it sounds like I'm encouraged because it sounds like you're more holistic in looking at the whole body, as you say. But what's your take on, the medical community is really going specialized. So they're not looking at it from a holistic standpoint. Where do you see the future of craniosacral therapy going as it complements what the traditional medical community is doing?
I have a friend named Jeffrey Smith, and he has a shout out to Jeffrey. He started the Institute for Responsible Technology. He has single-handedly done a lot in terms of anti-GMOs. And he talks about the tipping point. And we're certainly not there, but we're driving towards the tipping point where there can be a change in paradigm. So, excuse me, as a practical example, the medical community for the last 100 years has been very influenced by pharmaceuticals, which have a place, certainly. And they are treating symptoms. But there's a whole other generation, like the baby boomers, my generation, who's saying, maybe there's a different way to look at the body and be more holistic. So because of market demand, they're actually asking for different alternatives. And because of that, that's changing the way the doctors are starting to assess. Now, a big buzzword in medical technology and research is evidence-based. You hear that all the time. Although, honestly, I don't think a lot of people understand what that means. But the idea is that you do a study, and you have the evidence, and based on that, we will apply our techniques to certain things. But the evidence-based, because of the money and funding involved, often, is based on drug-related studies. But what if there was a different way to get the evidence and show that it was effective, even if it were non-medical and non-pharmaceutical? So, and thank you so much for asking these questions. So let's use Bill Gates as an example. You know who Bill Gates is, right?
Yeah.
He started Microsoft. He announced about 2 months ago now that he was going to donate $100 million of his fortune towards Alzheimer's research. And then, about 2 weeks ago or so, he let it be known that his dad, who was 92 years old, had Alzheimer's. That's really his motivation, to maybe invest a tenth of his fortune, or maybe not even that with him, but a good portion of it towards Alzheimer's research. Now, in that $100 million, I got to point out that $70 billion, according to some people, have been spent on Alzheimer's research in the last 10 years, and hardly anything has come of it. But he wants to invest $100 million, and he wants to invest, theoretically, $50 million in companies or research like mine that is non-pharmaceutical based. So I actually submitted a proposal to his company. I said, even if I had 1% of everything you're investing, I can show results in the next 2 years. I can do MRIs, I can do brain scans, I can show the difference that we are doing, because I'm replicating my study dozens of therapists around the country as we speak. Then we want to do this one study in Palm Beach Gardens in August. So the idea is that people understand from a consumer point of view, and even from a science point of view, that there might be other ways to do something. And as Bill Thomas, who I interviewed several years ago, who's a leader in, he created a TED Talk called Elderhood Rising, and Bill's just a wonderful guy. He says, I will consider anything in helping to treat seniors as long as it's evidence-based, and you can show the results. So that's what we're pioneering in senior and nursing care centers around the country, showing that let's do these initial studies, replicating what we've already done, and let's look at the results. And now we have PhDs and Alzheimer's researchers beginning to adapt commonly accepted testing practices and criteria for Alzheimer's that anyone can relate to, so we can show the change over time. But we're doing it with non-medical results. So essentially what I'm doing in speaking to a lot of conventions around the country is saying, hey, let's look at the basis of the neurology in cranial sacral therapy, and what is the science that even a modality, a hands-on modality like cranial sacral therapy can do. Can I say something else about that?
Yeah.
Science. So there has been a breakthrough in brain science in the last 10 years. And there has been a discovery of a whole nother functioning system in the brain called the lymphatic system. What does glymph mean? Glymph is short for glial cells, all right? And it's the most under-researched area in brain science for the last 100 years. Now, to give you a perspective, glial cells in the brain are like the stuffing in the brain. They're like the fascia of the brain that hold the neurons together. And there are 100 billion glial cells in the brain, and there's 10 billion, or a tenth as many, neurons. So my analogy is like a Christmas light. You ever see Christmas lights, and they got all the wires?
Yeah.
The glial cells are like the wires, and the bulbs are like the neurons. So for the last 100 years, neuronal science or neurology has studied just the synapses and not the glial cells. They're just starting to discover them. They're 90% of the brain. Do you think that might be important to study? Well, it turns out that the model of the lymphatic system, like I'm going to talk about in a conference in this next month in San Francisco, they basically take the cerebral spinal fluid, which bathes the surfaces of the brain, and this is a gross oversimplification, okay, but they basically take the cerebral spinal fluid, which bathes the surfaces of the brain, and draw it deep through all these connecting wires, like in the Christmas ball analogy, deep into every nook and cranny of the brain. And when they do that, every single space of what's called this interstitial fluid begins to bathe and recover the brain. When that happens, this lymphatic system begins to cleanse the brain itself. It begins to cleanse the brain itself. And this new science really explains, a lot of this has been done by University of Rochester, Nekegard, Illich, these people like that. They begin to realize that this system really gives us the analogy to explain, for example, how cranial sacral therapy works. Because, remember that river analogy? When the brain dries up and it's reflected in the lymphatic system, these channels in the brain swell up and the flow of fluid is narrower. This is on a very micro level of nanometers. But when that happens, that's what they feel, kind of like my analogy in research says, that creates the formation of these plaques and tangles. And their theory is simply that if we could increase the flow of cerebral spinal fluid to near normal levels, that could allow us to both prevent and perhaps even reverse the brain. So what I'm doing is really pioneering and mentioning new science that other people have discovered. These fellows that discovered the system got a Nobel Prize for this 10 years ago. We're saying, look, based on the discovery of the lymphatic system and its mechanism, we can more clearly explain the results that we're getting from cranial sacral therapy. Where we can take a therapist and within 12 weeks work on someone and start to see the change in ways that no one else has ever seen it.
Wow.
That is really, that's actually, I mean, that's super exciting. We're going to have you on periodically just to follow along. I mean, this sounds like it's going to be really groundbreaking. You're definitely at the forefront. We are at the top.
Thanks for giving me a chance to go more deeply into it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you want to give your website and social media where people can get in touch with you to learn more information?
You can go to preventingalzheimers.com, all one word, preventingalzheimers.com. And you can see my TED Talk, my interview with Jack Hanfield, other resources. My Facebook is Michael Morgan, and I'll be doing more and more Facebook Live when I go to conventions. So I have a number of Facebook Lives. My YouTube is Michael Morgan, and my Twitter is at @GMichaelMorgan. So those are all my different social media resources.
Fantastic. You've just been tuned for another amazing episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And Michael, it was a pleasure. Let's stay in touch, man.
Please. Really a pleasure. Great questions, you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have a good one.
On.
Thanks, man.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast.
please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective.